A tumultuous childhood and adolescence was what Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn had. His mother, who was only 15 when Littlejohn was born, was addicted to drugs. Growing up, he often lived with his paternal grandmother, Augustine, who ran a good-time house of gambling, prostitution, and drug use out of the home to help make ends meet, and his father, who was chronically ill with polio. His father was volatile and exposed his son to violence early on, once drawing a gun on him when Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn was only a child. When Littlejohn was 15, he learned to hotwire cars and began stealing them. Just weeks after his release from a juvenile facility for these thefts, he conducted an armed robbery. Shortly after he was let out of prison for that crime, he and Bethany held up the root and scoot. On the night of June 19, 1992, a robbery occurred at a convenience store in Oklahoma City, resulting in the death of the store owner, who was gunned down by two robbers. On that same night, at around 10:15 p.m., 31-year-old Kenneth Mears, the owner of the convenience store, was working with two employees, Tony Hulsey and Hulsey's brother, Danny Waldrop. While they were still doing their work, 20-year-old Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn and 25-year-old Glenn Roy Bethany entered the store and held Mears at gunpoint, with the intention of robbing him. Littlejohn, who had a long criminal record, at that time, he had just come out of prison for burglary, robbery, and assault, and Bethany was a drug dealer. The two men both owed money to a drug dealer known to them, and as they were out of money, the pair decided to commit an armed robbery in order to obtain cash to repay the debt. Armed with a gun, both Littlejohn and Bethany barged into the store and held Mears at gunpoint. During the armed holdup, one of the men shot Mears in the face. Both men then fled the store. The crime was witnessed by several people, including two of Mears' co-workers and bystanders outside the store. Mears died as a result of the shooting. At the time of his death, Mears, who was born in Indiana, left behind his mother, 3 brothers, and 2 sisters. His father died in 1984. Mears was laid to rest at Resthaven Memory Gardens after his funeral at South Colonial Chapel. Soon after the shooting, Bethany was arrested in Oklahoma City and remanded without bail at Oklahoma County Jail. Littlejohn remained on the run for about 5 days before he was apprehended in Wichita, Kansas, and extradited back to Oklahoma to be charged and tried for killing Mears. The two men were thus charged with the robbery murder of Mears. One Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn was tried by a jury in the District Court of Oklahoma County, before the Honorable Charles L. Owens. Littlejohn was convicted of robbery with a firearm, after conviction of 2 or more felonies, first-degree malice aforethought murder, and conspiracy to commit robbery with a firearm, after conviction of 2 or more felonies. After finding the existence of 3 aggravating circumstances. Littlejohn had previously been convicted of felonies involving the use or threat of violence to the person. Littlejohn knowingly created a great risk of death to more than one person. And Littlejohn posed a continuing threat to society. The jury set punishment at 300 years for the robbery, death for the murder, and 99 years for the conspiracy. The trial court sentenced Littlejohn accordingly. Prior to trial, Littlejohn challenged his competency to stand trial, and a post-examination competency jury trial was conducted. Pursuant to the statute in effect at the time, Littlejohn was required to prove his incompetence to stand trial by clear and convincing evidence. The United States Supreme Court held this standard violates a defendant's right to due process, and that the proper standard is a preponderance of the evidence. Pursuant to Cooper, this court remanded this matter to the District Court of Oklahoma County to determine whether it was feasible to conduct an appropriate retrospective competency hearing, and if so, to conduct the hearing using the correct standard. Littlejohn stipulated on remand that it was feasible to conduct a retrospective competency hearing, and on October 20 to 24, 1997, the Honorable Charles L. Owens conducted a retrospective post-evaluation competency jury trial. The jury found that Littlejohn had not proven by a preponderance of the evidence that he was incompetent to stand trial in November 1994. On March 11, 1993, Glenn Bethany was convicted of robbery and murder. The prosecution sought the death penalty for Bethany during his sentencing phase. However, Bethany was spared the death sentence and instead, he was jailed for life without any chance for parole. After he was sentenced to death, Emmanuel Littlejohn spent about 3 decades appealing against his sentence, and in all of his appeals, Littlejohn argued that he was innocent and that he never gunned down Kenneth Mears. However, none of his claims were accepted by the courts. While he was appealing against his death sentence, Emmanuel Littlejohn remained on death row at Oklahoma State Penitentiary for murdering Kenneth Mears. At one point while awaiting to be re-sentenced, Littlejohn allegedly heard a fellow prisoner named Christopher Jordan confessing to the 1999 murder of Paul Howell, a crime for which his accomplice Julius Jones was sentenced to death. In 2018, when Oklahoma prepared to pass laws to allow executions by nitrogen gas inhalation, Littlejohn and other inmates on death row gave their opinions on the new execution method, and Littlejohn did not agree with the method. Shortly before 11:30 a.m. on August 7, Emmanuel Littlejohn appeared on a screen wearing red prison scrubs over a white long-sleeve shirt. Still wearing handcuffs, he raised his right wrist. He stated his full name and the prisoner number he had been assigned by the Oklahoma Department of Corrections more than 3 decades earlier. For more than 2 hours, Littlejohn had watched a video feed of the Clemency hearing to determine whether the state would recommend the governor call off his September 26 execution. Sitting before the state's Pardon and Parole Board, attorneys for the state had already described, in detail, the murder that landed the 52-year-old on death row. The lawyers attacked his character and accused him of the violent rape charges that prosecutors had previously dropped against him. The victim's family members talked about the lingering impact of their loved one's death decades after he'd been killed. He spoke for just 3.5 minutes. A few minutes later, the board issued a 3-2 recommendation that Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt spare Littlejohn's life. But in the 7 weeks since the Clemency hearing, Stitt has offered little indication of whether he will save Littlejohn's life. On the morning of September 26, 2024, 52-year-old Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn was put to death via lethal injection at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Littlejohn was reportedly administered with a 3-drug lethal injection of midazolam, vicuronium bromide and potassium chloride, and later pronounced dead at 10:17 a.m. Before losing consciousness, Littlejohn was reported to have turned to his mother and daughter and said his last words, "Everything is going to be okay. I love you." Littlejohn requested a meat lovers-style pizza, 2 slices of cheesecake, and Coca-Cola for his final meal. He was 52 years at the time of his execution. Thank you for watching Death Row.